Greetings, friends. I'm gonna do a video about a section from the ebook I just released called "Studies in Thymos," and it's from the section on Fukuyama, and we're just gonna go into some of Fukuyama's ideas about Thymos. In particular, this idea of isothymia versus megalothymia, and I'll explain what they mean in a second. But we're gonna just read through this section. Um, just as a slight backdrop to this. Sorry, my phone's gone off. Fukuyama's idea of thymos are very recognition orientated. So they're very much. I mean, he does talk about the ancient Greeks and Plato and stuff as well, but he really does take a lot of his ideas of, in particular, this idea of iso and megalothymia. He takes it from we could say the kind of Hegelian school of thought. Like Kohevi is someone he's been very influenced by, although he differs from in some kind of complicated ways. But these are basically, we could say, the kind of Hegelian school, which is very concentrated on recognition. And recognition, of course, goes back to the slave master dialectic and the ability to fight to the death for the recognition of the other as fully human or fully free. So this is kind of different sorts of recognition which Fukuyama is discussing, and one is called isothymia and one is called megalothymia. And you can probably tell by the name megalomaniac, megalodon, like the big shark. Megalo generally refers to kind of something which is exaggerated or excessive or more. So you can kind of already by the name start to see the difference, to what degree, to what extent or extremity of recognition are we driven by, and so on. So I'm just gonna read this section, and then maybe I'll just talk a bit about it afterwards. So, okay, isothymia versus megalothymia. The question of the end of history, and these quotes are always quotes from Fukuyama. So this is the section I concentrate. This is the last section of the book, and I concentrate, pretty exclusively on Fukuyama. In particular, his last section of the end of history, which is titled "The Last Man," we're kind of dealing with where he talks a lot about Thymos in more detail. The question of the end of history then amounts to a question of the future of Thymos, whether liberal democracy adequately satisfies the desire for recognition, as Gohevi says, or whether it will remain radically unfulfilled and therefore capable of manifesting itself in an entirely different form. End quote. So, I said before, Fukuyama differs from Gohevi in a certain regard, and that regard could be seen as the way in which Gohevi really does think like liberal democracy, kind of multinational liberal democracy, are the true end of history, and Fukuyama is, he's I suppose he still is he still is a liberal, and he still believes liberal democracy is the end of history. Obviously, he's known for that, but he's skeptical of the stability, the authenticity, and so on of that system as regards to thymotic faculties and impulses. And I think so. So Thymos is the kind of lens where Fukuyama gets a little bit more subversive. He gets a little bit more. He questions the stability of liberal democracy more. I'm not saying he abandons it. He doesn't go, okay, we need something different. But he believes, we're going to see in this section, that if liberal democracy fails, he thinks it's problems to do with Thymos, which will be the cause of that failure. So I'll keep reading. The question concerning Thymos, as we could call it, is largely determined by the right wing opposition to liberalism, Fukuyama predicts, and this is of course the kind of historical point also that is implicit, I think anyway, in Fukuyama's text. Communism, which was the most successful left-wing opponent to liberalism, and its death, which is the historical crisis which this book responds to, sees any true opposition to liberalism from the left as no longer being viable. The egalitarian notions of communism were contradictory in the sense that the anti-liberal motivation of its leaders like Lenin and Trotsky were only possible under the far less egalitarian conditions of Russia compared to the West. Ultimately, recognition has a higher quality the more exclusive and hierarchical it is, and its indefinite application to a mass of democratic voters and consumers eventually undermines its value. Men like Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, who were great men in their own right, and this is something that Fukuyama actually asserts in this section, would not be possible in the actually more egalitarian world of Western democracies. This actually makes perfect sense if you look at how left-wing leaders like Sanders and Corbyn are treated by their own parties, or have been treated by their own parties, because they're both largely irrelevant now. So their stance as a threat to technocratic liberalism was largely destroyed by their own followers, who, instead of following their lead, began a 4-year-long accusation campaign which burdens the leaders with an endless list of rather petty challenges about a lack of diversity, representation, and of course normally stems from the usual, what we could call safetyism, of overgrown children who, when their petty and often insignificant demands are not met, begin insisting they are, in the language, as the language of psychiatry loves to say, traumatized, or that they feel unsafe. And this is just as a side note, this is like the only part in the book that I do become a little bit more polemic. The rest of the book is like really just informative and educational. I couldn't help it in this section because I was talking about the current world. The rest of the book, I'm talking about like ancient Greece, or I'm talking about Hobbes's time, or I'm talking about Freud or something, Nietzsche. I like, and then in this section, because we're thinking about Thymos as it pertains to the current political scene, I couldn't help but get a little bit polemic. So I just as a side note, the whole book isn't like this. Most of the book is very detached. I needn't go over the history of the left over the past 10 years. I also have tried to not be polemic through these essays, yet it needs to be noticed that the downfall of the Western left, it being subsumed into technocracy, has largely something to do with one of Fukuyama's theories concerning thymos, and that is isothymia versus megalothymia. And here we're going to get into more of a definition. Isothymia is the desire for recognition as equals, and so dominates in democratic nations. The hyper-egalitarian ideology of the left is often in contradiction to the necessary discipline and courage, usually traits emerging when the standard of recognition is very unequal and high, an ability to follow exceptional leadership, which a political subversion of liberalism would require. The cheapening of recognition, making it something you don't fight to the death for, but something you are therapeutically entitled to, or on the basis of your personal history of propagandized trauma. A more moderate thymotic recognition is necessary for the good of communal living, and this is something Fukuyama gets into later. But it's not adequate. So I'm not saying all thymos has to be, and neither is Fukuyama saying all thymos has to be fight to the death, like extreme, death or glory. But like, you need to have some more moderate thymotic kind of being for just communal life. But that's different to the task, which is being set by those who wish to subvert liberal capitalism, which is an extremely ambitious political task. So I'm getting into a bit here about thymos as it relates, not just to like, how do you get on with your neighbor. I'm talking about thymos as it relates to the very ambitious task of revolutionarily, surpassing liberal capitalism and so on. So megalothymia, on the other hand, designates a desire for recognition as higher than others. So just to summarize that, isothymia is a desire for recognition as equals, and megalothymia is a desire for recognition as higher. It could be imagined as the motivating force for the likes, as is megalothymia, could be imagined as the motivating force for the likes of Lenin, Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Cromwell, just to name some perhaps more extreme examples, in regards to the fall of communism and the ability of the left to produce truly historically exceptional groups and leaders to subvert liberalism. We can see that the left's inclination to isothymia has ultimately been a self-defeating pursuit. and has held back the more exceptional and politically threatening elements of the left. The right, on the other hand, is not so inclined to isothymia, which doesn't necessarily mean they are automatically inclined to megalothymia, but and so it will likely become somewhat more of an opposition to liberalism in the 21st century. Fukuyama wrote this in 1998. More than, was it 1998? Am I imagining that this book came out? That may have been a typo. I have to double check that. Anyway, whatever. We're talking at least more than 20 years, possibly more. I think it was 92 this book came out in. Yeah, I think that's a typo. Sorry. Okay, never mind. Let's just keep going. More than 20 years later, it is noticeably true that the left has been dissolved into the power of liberal technocracy, while the right has become the more subversive position. I'm not trying to endorse either side here, and I'm someone who generally refrains from identifying with either side, but it's more so to commend Fukuyama's predictions, and so as to show that there might be something valuable in his ideas, and in particular this idea of megalo versus isothymia. Another quote from Fukuyama: Karl Marx represented one great pole of criticism of Hegel by denying that recognition was universal. The existence of economic classes prevented it from becoming so. But on the other, a more profound pole of criticism was that raised by Nietzsche. For Nietzsche's thought was never embodied in mass movements or political parties, as was that of Marx. The questions he raised about the direction of the human historical process remain unresolved and are likely to be unresolved after the disappearance of the last Marxist regime from the face of the earth. End quote. So Fukuyama uses Nietzsche as a foil, and we could say true inheritor of Marx's anti-liberalism. This stance of Thymos differs accordingly. Another quote from Fukuyama: the liberal democratic state did not constitute a synthesis of the morality of the master and the morality of the slave, as Hegel had said. For Nietzsche, it represented an unconditional victory of the slave. Nietzsche believed that no true human excellence, greatness, or nobility was possible except in aristocratic societies. In other words, true freedom or creativity could arise only out of megalothymia, that is, the desire to be recognized as better than others. End quote. Nietzsche's problem with the history of egalitarian thought from the French Revolution onwards is somewhat complex. Nietzsche held Napoleon in high regard, for example, and so doesn't simply believe men before this time were great while men after this time were meek and terrible. So it's not totally historically reductive. He's not saying the French Revolution was like everything after the French Revolution was terrible and everyone was weak and terrible and everything before that was great. This is not what he's saying. It would be more accurate to say that Nietzsche believes that the values which were brought forth through a progressive modernity, which degrade and devalue thymotic psychology out of perhaps the compassionate psychology of Christianity, and then that secularized into egalitarian values, liberalism, and so on, are ultimately detrimental to the cultivation of great people. The aims and objectives may often be justifiable and noble in their own right, but their psychopolitical implementation is self-defeating to the kinds of living, breathing embodiments of exceptional people that are required to truly actualize such noble goals. Those that died and risked their lives in the French Revolution are properly higher in the sense that that risking life for freedom is the act which distinguishes slave from master. The overall values which came along with that historical event are, however, at some point or another fatal to the very spirit of freedom and heroic action which made these events possible. The fact that it ended up being Eastern and South American nations where real Marxist revolutionary action took place and not in Western Europe where Marx was from and was writing about is testament to this paradox. We could say that the conditions that create exceptional men and the values which those men advocate for can often be in deep contradiction with each other. So that's the end of the section. I think that I was really happy with this section because I learned something from reading Fukuyama in the sense that there's a sort of contention between the conditions the historical events form in and the ideals which they aim to achieve. So you have this paradox of like, well, it wasn't in Western Europe and in the actually much more. So we'll put it this way: you have more democratic and equal values um, in the West, in Western Europe and the United States, far more so than the rest of the world. But it took a country that was like Russia that was far more, and other South America and so on, and parts of Asia too, that were basically took places that were far less democratic and equal to actualize this goal of communism, right? And the reason being is because in order to pull off like something like this, you need exceptional leaders, and you also need people that exceptional leaders and exceptional followers. It's not just all about exceptional leaders. You need people who know how to follow. And I suppose what he's saying is that the political conditions are often different to the economic and the social conditions, and the political conditions for something like a subversion of liberal capitalism were much better paradoxically in the unequal societies, because these societies had a very high standard of what recognition means. And then therefore the struggle to overthrow liberal capitalism was possible because of it. And if you look, and I think the Jeremy Corbyn and the Bernie Sanders examples make a lot of sense to me when I think about how those, because I was one of those people who was, relatively hopeful that I had numerous disagreements with the kind of package ideology which comes along with it, but I understood that there's a real need to change the system we have, and I think Corbyn and Sanders gave a lot of people some sort of optimism. But you see how these people relate to their own party, and then you see a kind of lack of strong leadership and a lack of an ability of the followers to be able to follow, and a lack of the ability to be able to endure and overcome significant struggle and so on to actually pull off something which is politically very ambitious. So you kind of have to wonder like why this can happen in certain parts. If you're talking about the end of history and it's like there's no ability to pull off these really ambitious events which are struggled for and fought for, you have to wonder like why can that happen in one epoch and not another? Why can that happen in one nation and not in the other? I mean, we're all humans, right? So I mean, like, what's the difference if everything's determined by merely a linear historical condition? Because the paradox here being that the nations that skipped the whole kind of liberal egalitarianism part were in a much better position to do something like communism, because they had political conditions that were actually much better for a revolutionary moment, as opposed to the West, which had political conditions which, despite living there being more equal in many ways, was it's a very Hegelian reversal in the sense that very benefit was, that very progressiveness was not putting themselves in a better position to make the next step. It was putting themselves in a position which was actually detrimental to making any step. There's a kind of stasis. There's a kind of historical stasis which we're talking about whenever we're talking about the end of history and so on. So I think Fukuyama is he's playing with these concepts as a way to figure out how that stasis comes about. Now, the Nietzschean point that was brought up was, okay, and I've realized the reason that date of 98 was wrong was because this is actually not the official text. This is a draft, but this is basically the same as what's in the book, just by the way. But it's just a draft, so if there's a few errors there, which I'm reading from a draft, so there's a few errors there, was what I'm trying to say. But anyway, the Nietzschean point is that and this is kind of Nietzsche's genius in a sense, that he understood he understood this paradox, basically, that the conditions for creating a kind of dispersing recognition in this super linear egalitarian manner wasn't necessarily a problem in the sense that the end goals were all terrible. It was a problem in the sense that it creates such a kind of degradation um, of of recognition of kind of thymotic faculty and of thymotic being. It cheapens it, it levels it, it makes it user friendly, right? So like sometimes when I'm reading this, I think of like Michael Crawford's book about driving, where he talks about how cars were made more and more user friendly, and the more and more user friendly cars are made, the more paradoxically the more dangerous driving becomes, because people aren't. Yes, the cars are very safe and the roads are very safe, but the people using them are really really stupid because they haven't learned how to use a car because it's user friendly. Like the progress is self defeating towards the very aim of driving, and it's the very aim being safety. The more and more user friendly you make the cars, the more and more dangerous you paradoxically make it. I think you can make the same analogy about history, where it's like the kind of egalitarian, enlightened trajectory of the left, or not just the left, of the West in general, right and left, is in a sense kind of self-defeating to allowing the exceptionality of these great political figures and historical figures, which can actually do something like overcome a failing order and failing system, and install something, better and new, which is the very aim of something, which is the very aim of progress, right? So you see these paradoxes come out, and I think Nietzsche's value to Fukuyama is very much that he was aware of these paradoxes on a kind of psychopolitical level. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you, I will put a link in the description for the book. It's on Gumroad, so get it if you want. I'll probably do more videos like this, just breaking down little sections and discussing some of the themes and so on. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and see you later.